When David Richardson answered that letter in 1887, he thought he was getting exactly what he'd paid for, a wife to help run his cattle ranch in Montana Territory. What he got instead was Patricia Walsh stepping off that dusty stagecoach with worn-out boots, hollow eyes, and a bundle pressed tight against her chest that would change everything. Because sometimes the biggest lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves. And sometimes the most desperate gambles lead to the most unexpected love stories. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The advertisement had been simple enough. David Richardson had paid good money to place it in 3 different Eastern newspapers, each word carefully chosen to attract the right kind of woman. Hard-working rancher seeks dedicated wife for partnership in Montana Territory cattle operation. Must be of good moral character, willing to work and prepared for frontier life. Serious inquiries only. He'd received 17 responses over the course of 4 months. Most were too flowery, filled with romantic notions about Western life, that told him these women had no idea what they were getting into. A few were too desperate, revealing circumstances that made David uncomfortable. But Patricia Walsh's letter had been different. It was direct without being cold, honest about her situation without being pathetic, and practical in a way that suggested she understood exactly what kind of arrangement this would be. Mr. Richardson, she had written in neat, careful handwriting, I am 24 years old in good health and experienced in household management and basic medical care. I've worked as a seamstress and taught school briefly before family circumstances required me to seek new opportunities. I understand you're looking for a partner in your ranching endeavors, not a decoration for your parlor. I'm prepared for hard work and frontier conditions. If you find my qualifications suitable, I can arrange travel to Montana Territory within 6 weeks of receiving your response. There had been something about the formality of her tone, the way she avoided any mention of romance or affection, that appealed to David. At 32, he'd given up on finding love the conventional way. What he needed was competence, reliability, and someone who wouldn't faint at the sight of blood when it came time to birth calves or treat injuries. Patricia Walsh sounded like exactly that kind of woman. Their correspondence had continued for 2 months. She asked practical questions about the ranch, the nearest town, what kind of medical supplies he kept on hand. He found himself looking forward to her letters, appreciating her straightforward approach to what others might have dressed up in romantic language. When she wrote that she would arrive on the October 15th stage from Billings, David felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. Finally, he was taking control of his life in a way that made sense. The morning Patricia was scheduled to arrive, David woke before dawn with an energy he hadn't felt since his father died and left him the ranch 3 years earlier. He'd spent the previous week making improvements to the small cabin that served as his home. Nothing fancy. He'd added a proper washstand to the bedroom, built shelves in the kitchen area, and even managed to find a decent mirror in town to hang near the door. The place was still rough by city standards, but it was clean and functional, which seemed to be what Patricia valued. Copper Creek wasn't much of a town, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other businesses serving the scattered ranches and mining claims in the area. But it was where the stage stopped, and David arrived at Henderson's general store an hour early, unable to contain his anticipation. He'd dressed in his best clothes, which admittedly weren't saying much. But his shirt was clean and his boots were polished. Martha Henderson, who ran the store with her husband Bill, had been watching David pace the porch for 20 minutes when she finally came outside with a cup of coffee. "You're going to wear a hole in those boards if you keep that up," she said, offering him the cup. "The stage won't get here any faster just because you're worried about it." "I'm not worried," David replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I just want to make a good impression. From what you've told me about her letters, it sounds like she's more interested in whether you can provide a steady life than whether you can provide fancy manners," Martha observed. "Though I've got to say, David, you're taking an awful big risk marrying a woman sight unseen." It was a conversation they'd had before, and David gave his usual response. "No bigger risk than marrying someone for the wrong reasons. At least this way we both know what we're getting into." When the stage finally appeared as a dust cloud on the horizon, David felt his pulse quicken. He'd imagined this moment dozens of times over the past weeks, trying to picture what Patricia would look like, how she would carry herself, what her voice would sound like. Her letters suggested someone practical and no-nonsense, but beyond that, he had only his imagination to work with. The stage rolled to a stop in front of Henderson's store with its usual dramatic flourish of dust and noise. The driver, Tom Bradley, had been running this route for 5 years and knew everyone in Copper Creek by name. He climbed down from his seat with a grin and started untying baggage from the roof of the coach. "Got your bride for you, David," Tom called out cheerfully, "along with a traveling salesman and Mrs. Peterson's niece from Chicago." The coach door opened and the first passenger stepped out, a portly man in a wrinkled suit who immediately began complaining about the dust and the rough roads. Next came a young woman in an elaborate blue dress who looked around Copper Creek with obvious disappointment. David barely noticed either of them because the third passenger was stepping down from the coach, and he knew immediately that this had to be Patricia. She was smaller than he'd expected, though that might have been because of how she was holding herself. Shoulders hunched slightly as if bracing against something. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her dress, while clean, showed signs of hard wear and careful mending. But it was her eyes that caught David's attention, dark brown and alert, taking in everything around her with an intensity that suggested she was constantly evaluating her surroundings for potential threats or opportunities. What threw him completely off balance was the bundle she carried pressed against her chest. It was wrapped in a faded quilt, and as David watched, one small edge of the fabric shifted, revealing what was unmistakably a tiny hand. Patricia Walsh had brought a baby. For a moment, David stood frozen, his mind struggling to process this development. In all their correspondence, through months of letters discussing practical arrangements and mutual expectations, Patricia had never once mentioned a child. The omission was so glaring, so fundamental, that David felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Patricia seemed to recognize him immediately, probably because he was the only man in the small crowd who was staring at her with a mixture of recognition and confusion. She walked toward him with deliberate steps, and David noticed that despite her obvious exhaustion, she held her head high. "Mr. Richardson," she said, and her voice was exactly as he had imagined it, clear and direct, with just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "I'm Patricia Walsh. Thank you for meeting me." Up close, David could see that she was probably quite pretty under normal circumstances, but these were clearly not normal circumstances. Her skin was pale with exhaustion, there were dark circles under her eyes, and her lips were pressed together in a way that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Miss Walsh," David managed, his eyes inevitably drawn to the bundle in her arms. You didn't mention—" "No," Patricia said simply. "I didn't." She met his gaze directly, and David saw a flash of something, defiance maybe, or desperation. "If this changes your mind about our arrangement, I understand. But I have nowhere else to go, and neither does she." The baby, apparently a girl, chose that moment to make a small sound, not quite crying, but definitely stirring. Patricia automatically adjusted her hold, and David caught a glimpse of a tiny face surrounded by wispy dark hair. The logical part of David's mind was cataloguing all the reasons this was a problem. He'd arranged for a wife, not a family. He'd planned for the additional expense and work of one person, not two. He knew nothing about babies or children. His ranch was isolated and dangerous in ways that might not be suitable for an infant. But there was something about the way Patricia was standing there. clearly braced for rejection but refusing to apologize or beg. That stirred something unexpected in David's chest. She reminded him of the wild horses that sometimes wandered onto his property, beautiful and proud, but ready to run at the first sign of threat. "What's her name?" David asked quietly. Patricia's eyes widened slightly, as if this wasn't the question she'd been expecting. "Sarah," she said. Sarah rose. "She's 4 months old. And her father?" The question hung in the air between them, and David watched emotions flicker across Patricia's face. Pain, anger, fear, and finally a kind of resigned determination. "Dead," Patricia said flatly. "Died before she was born." It was clearly all the explanation she was prepared to offer, at least here in front of half the town. David found himself nodding, though he wasn't sure why. "My wagon's just over there," he said, gesturing toward where he'd tied his horses. "Are you ready to see the ranch?" Yeah. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The relief that crossed Patricia's face was so brief, David almost missed it, but it was enough to tell him he'd made the right choice. Whatever complications this baby represented, whatever Patricia wasn't telling him about her circumstances, turning them away wasn't an option he could live with. As they walked toward his wagon, David noticed that Patricia moved carefully, as if she was in pain or simply exhausted beyond measure. The baby, Sarah, seemed content enough in her mother's arms, but David could see that the bundle of blankets concealing her was thin and worn, the kind of makeshift arrangement that spoke of limited resources and careful economy. "How long have you been traveling?" David asked as he helped Patricia up onto the wagon seat. 6 days on the stage from Chicago," Patricia replied. "Before that." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It's been a long journey." David had 1,000 questions, but something about Patricia's posture warned him that now wasn't the time for pressing for details. Instead, he focused on getting them home, pointing out landmarks along the route and explaining what she was seeing as they drove through the late afternoon landscape of rolling hills dotted with cattle. "The ranch covers about 2,000 acres. David explained as they topped a rise that gave them a view of the valley where his cabin sat. "Most of it's grazing land, but there's good water and timber up in those hills. The cabin's not much to look at, but it's solid and warm." Patricia studied the landscape with the same intense attention she'd given Copper Creek, and David found himself wondering what she was thinking. The Montana Territory was beautiful in its own way, but it was harsh and unforgiving, especially for someone accustomed to city life. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and during the winter months they could be snowed in for weeks at a time. "It's bigger than I expected," Patricia said finally. "Your ranch, I mean, and more open." "Does that worry you?" Patricia shifted Sarah in her arms, and David caught another glimpse of the baby's face. She had her mother's dark hair and what looked like it might develop into her mother's determined chin. "Everything worries me," Patricia said quietly, "but this feels like a place where a person could start over." There was something in her tone that made David glance at her sharply, but Patricia was looking ahead toward the cabin, and her expression revealed nothing. As they approached the small building David called home, David tried to see it through Patricia's eyes. It was well built and weatherproof, with a stone chimney and glass windows that had cost him extra to have hauled out from Billings. But it was still just one room with a small loft, designed for a single man with simple needs. "I know it's not much," David said as he helped Patricia down from the wagon, "but I was thinking we could add on come spring, maybe build a proper bedroom and expand the kitchen area." Patricia stood in front of the cabin holding Sarah, and for a moment David was afraid she was going to cry. Instead, she turned to him with something that might have been the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "this is the nicest home I've seen in a very long time." as David carried Patricia's single battered suitcase toward the cabin door, he realized that his carefully planned arrangement had just become something entirely different. He'd thought he was getting a practical partnership with a woman who understood frontier life. Instead, he was apparently getting a family, complete with all the complications and unknowns that entailed. But as he watched Patricia walk toward his cabin, her shoulders finally relaxing slightly as she took in what was to be her new home, David found that the prospect didn't frighten him as much as it should have. If anything, the quiet satisfaction he'd felt about his mail-order bride arrangement had been replaced by something more complex and infinitely more interesting. Whatever Patricia Walsh wasn't telling him about her past, whatever circumstances had led her to answer his advertisement with a secret baby in tow, David had the feeling that his life was about to become far more complicated and far more meaningful than he'd ever planned. The first night was awkward in ways David hadn't anticipated. He'd given Patricia and Sarah the main sleeping area while he made do with blankets near the fireplace, but the cabin was small enough that privacy was essentially impossible. Every sound the baby made seemed amplified in the quiet space. Her soft breathing, the rustle of blankets when Patricia shifted her position, the gentle murmur of Patricia's voice during the middle of the night feeding that David pretended not to hear. Patricia had accepted his offer of food with quiet gratitude, though she ate sparingly and kept Sarah close throughout the simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. David found himself stealing glances at both of them, trying to reconcile the woman from the carefully worded letters with this exhausted young mother who seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "The nearest doctor is in Helena," David said, as Patricia settled Sarah for sleep. "That's a 2-day ride in good weather. But Mrs. Henderson in town has helped birth most of the babies in these parts, and there's a woman named Clara Martinez, about 10 miles south, who knows more about healing than most doctors I've met." Patricia looked up from where she was gently rocking Sarah. "Thank you, that's good to know. Have you? I mean, has Sarah been sick at all? Travel couldn't have been easy with an infant." "She's been remarkably good," Patricia said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice for the first time since she'd stepped off the stage. "Better than I had any right to expect, considering." She didn't finish the sentence, but David caught the implication. Whatever circumstances had led Patricia to make this journey, they hadn't been ideal for traveling with a baby. "Patricia," David said carefully, "I don't want to pry, but if there's anything I should know about Sarah's health, about why you left Chicago, about what you might need, it would help me to understand." Patricia was quiet for so long that David wondered if she was going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Her father wasn't my husband," she said. "I know what that makes me in most people's eyes, but I need you to know that I never intended. Things just happened in ways I couldn't control." David felt something tighten in his chest, though whether it was anger on her behalf or something else entirely, he wasn't sure. What happened to him? He died in a factory accident 2 weeks before Sarah was born. "We'd planned to marry, but..." Patricia shrugged helplessly. "Plans don't always work out the way you expect." "And his family? Couldn't they help?" Patricia's laugh was bitter. "His family made it very clear that they wanted nothing to do with me or Sarah. According to them, I was a loose woman who'd trapped their son, and Sarah was my problem to solve." David felt a flash of anger toward people he'd never met. "What about your own family?" "My parents died when I was 19. I have an uncle in Boston, but he..." Patricia paused, choosing her words carefully. "He made it clear that his help came with conditions I wasn't willing to accept." The implication hung heavy in the air, and David found his hands clenching into fists. He forced himself to relax, focusing on the practical aspects of the situation rather than his growing fury at the people who had failed this woman and her child. So you answered my advertisement, David said. I answered 17 advertisements, Patricia corrected. Yours was the only response that sounded like it came from someone decent. Something warm settled in David's chest at her words, though he tried not to read too much into them. What made you think that? You asked practical questions. Instead of requesting a photograph, you wanted to know about my skills and experience, not my measurements or whether I was pretty. And when I asked about the medical supplies you kept on hand, you gave me a detailed list instead of asking why I wanted to know. David remembered that letter. Patricia had inquired about everything from basic bandages to more serious medical equipment, and he'd assumed she was simply being thorough about frontier preparedness. You were thinking about Sarah even then, he realized. Every decision I've made for the past 6 months has been about Sarah, Patricia said quietly. I know I should have told you about her in my letters, but I was afraid you'd refuse to meet me, and we had nowhere else to go. David looked at Patricia, holding her sleeping daughter, and he realized that his anger wasn't directed at her deception. If anything, he was impressed by the courage it must have taken to travel across the country with an infant, trusting her future to a complete stranger based on nothing more than a few letters. I'm glad you didn't tell me, David said, and Patricia's head snapped up in surprise. If you had, I might have said no out of fear, and that would have been my loss. The look Patricia gave him was complex, relief mixed with wariness, as if she was afraid to believe his acceptance was genuine. You don't know anything about babies, she pointed out. No, David agreed, but I know about taking care of things that depend on me, and I learn fast. Over the next few days, David discovered that having a baby in the house changed everything in ways both small and profound. His morning routine, which had been the same for 3 years, suddenly revolved around Sarah's feeding schedule. The sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, horses nickering, the distant bark of his dog. Recs were now punctuated by an infant's cries and Patricia's soft voice singing lullabies. Patricia threw herself into ranch life with an intensity that impressed David. She insisted on learning how to milk the cow, despite never having done it before. She took over the cooking with obvious relief, transforming David's simple meals into something that actually tasted good. She mended his clothes with skillful hands, and when he came in one evening with a gash on his arm from a piece of broken equipment, she cleaned and bandaged the wound with the competence of someone who'd had medical training. Where did you learn to do that? David asked as Patricia finished wrapping his arm. I helped a doctor in Chicago for a few months when money was tight, Patricia replied. He couldn't afford to pay much, but he taught me basic wound care and how to recognize signs of infection. That's a useful skill out here. That's what I thought when I wrote to you about medical supplies. Patricia's smile was small but genuine. I figured a ranch would need someone who could patch people up when the doctor was too far away. David found himself looking forward to these conversations. Brief moments when Patricia's guard would drop and he'd catch glimpses of the intelligent, capable woman behind the exhausted facade. She was clearly well-educated, despite her current circumstances, and her observations about ranch life showed a quick mind that could adapt to new situations. But it was watching Patricia with Sarah that really changed David's perspective on his new family. The love between mother and daughter was so pure and fierce that it took his breath away. Patricia might be reserved and cautious around David, but with Sarah she was completely different, tender, playful and absolutely devoted. One afternoon, while Patricia was hanging laundry and Sarah was sleeping in a makeshift cradle David had built from an old wooden crate, David found himself really looking at the baby for the first time. She was tiny, probably smaller than she should be for 4 months old, but she seemed healthy enough. Her hair was dark like Patricia's, but her eyes, when they were open, were a startling blue-green that didn't match either parent David could imagine. She's beautiful, David said when Patricia came back inside. She looks like her father, Patricia said quietly. and there was a sadness in her voice that made David's chest tight. "Same eyes, same stubborn chin. Tell me about him." Patricia was quiet for a moment, folding one of David's shirts with careful precision. "His name was Michael. Michael O'Brien. He worked at the grain mill where I was employed as a seamstress. He was kind and funny. He used to bring me flowers he'd picked on his way to work, even though the other men teased him about it. How long were you together?" "About a year. We were going to be married in the spring, after he'd saved enough money for us to rent a proper place." Patricia's hands stilled on the laundry. "The mill explosion happened in February. 15 men died, including Michael. I found out I was carrying Sarah 2 weeks later." David felt his throat tighten at the quiet pain in Patricia's voice. "I'm sorry." "The worst part wasn't losing Michael, though that was terrible enough," Patricia continued. "The worst part was how quickly everything changed. One day I was a respectable woman engaged to a good man, and the next I was a fallen woman with a baby and no means of support. The mill owners paid compensation to the widows, but since Michael and I weren't married, I got nothing. The seamstress shop let me go when I started showing. My landlord evicted me when I couldn't pay rent. What did you do?" "Whatever I could. I took in washing, mended clothes for people, cleaned houses when I could find work that didn't require me to be on my feet all day." Patricia's voice was matter of fact, but David could hear the steel underneath. "I saved every penny I could, and when Sarah was born, I started answering advertisements for mail-order brides." "How many responses did you actually get?" 3. One man wanted to know if I was pretty and could cook fancy meals. Another one asked detailed questions about my virtue that made it clear he was looking for something other than a wife. Patricia's mouth tightened. "You were the only one who seemed interested in having a partner rather than a possession." David felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "Their loss," he said simply. That evening, as they sat around the small table after supper, Sarah began to fuss in Patricia's arms. Nothing Patricia tried seemed to settle her. Feeding, rocking, checking her diaper, singing softly. Finally, Patricia looked up at David with exhausted frustration. "I don't know what's wrong with her. She's been so good during the journey, but maybe the change in routine—" "May I?" David asked, holding out his arms. Patricia hesitated for a moment, then carefully transferred Sarah to David's larger hands. The baby felt impossibly small and fragile, but David had handled newborn calves and colts, and the basic principle was the same: gentle confidence and calm energy. Sarah continued to fuss for a moment, then seemed to be startled into quiet by this new development. She stared up at David with those unusual blue-green eyes, and David found himself talking to her in the same low, soothing voice he used with skittish horses. "There you go, little one. Just needed a change of scenery, didn't you? Your mama's been taking such good care of you, but sometimes a different perspective helps." Sarah made a small sound that wasn't quite crying, and one tiny hand waved in the air. Without thinking, David offered her his finger, and she immediately grasped it with surprising strength. "Well, look at that," David murmured. "You've got a good grip there, Sarah Rose. Gonna be strong like your mama." When David looked up, he found Patricia watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was surprise there, and something that might have been a relief, but also a wariness that suggested she wasn't used to anyone else taking an interest in her daughter's well-being. "She likes you," Patricia said softly. "She's easy to like," David replied, gently bouncing Sarah in his arms. "Aren't you, sweetheart?" The endearment slipped out naturally, and David saw Patricia's eyes widen slightly. But Sarah seemed content enough in his arms, her fussing replaced by what looked almost like curiosity as she continued to study his face. "I never expected," Patricia began, then stopped herself. "What?" "I never expected you to care about her. I thought you might tolerate her presence because you had to, but I didn't think you'd actually—" She gestured helplessly. "Actually what?" "I actually want her here." David looked down at Sarah, who had relaxed completely in his arms and seemed to be fighting sleep. The fierce protectiveness he'd felt earlier when Patricia described her circumstances returned, but now it extended to this tiny person who had done nothing wrong except be born into difficult circumstances. "Patricia," David said quietly, "when I placed that advertisement, I was looking for someone to help me build a life worth living. I thought that meant finding a practical woman who could handle frontier hardships. But maybe what I really needed was a family." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "David, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," David interrupted gently, "because it's the truth. I've been going through the motions of living for the past 3 years, but that's all it was. Motions. Having you and Sarah here, it feels like my house is finally a home." Sarah chose that moment to fall asleep in David's arms, her tiny face peaceful and trusting. David looked at her, then at Patricia, and realized that his carefully planned mail-order bride arrangement had become something he'd never dared to hope for. "We should probably talk about the marriage ceremony," David said quietly, not wanting to wake Sarah. "I spoke to Reverend Williams when I was in town last week. He can perform the service whenever you're ready." Patricia nodded slowly. "And you're sure about this?" "About all of it." David thought about the question seriously before answering. A week ago, his life had been predictable and solitary. Now he was holding a baby who wasn't his, committed to a woman whose past contained secrets he was only beginning to understand, and looking at a future that was entirely different from anything he'd planned. "I'm sure," he said, and meant it completely. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning with only 4 witnesses present. Reverend Williams, Martha and Bill Henderson, and Clara Martinez, who had ridden in from her homestead specifically for the occasion. Patricia wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself from fabric David had bought in town, and she carried a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that Clara had gathered along the trail. Sarah, now 5 months old and beginning to show real personality, gurgled contentedly in Martha Henderson's arms throughout the brief ceremony. David found himself stealing glances at her during Reverend Williams' words, marveling at how natural it felt to think of her as his daughter. The legal papers would never reflect it, but in his heart, Sarah Rose had become Sarah Rose Richardson the moment he'd first held her. "Do you, David Richardson, take Patricia Walsh to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," David said, looking directly into Patricia's dark eyes. They were still guarded, but there was something softer there now, a tentative trust that hadn't existed when she'd first stepped off that stage. "Do you, Patricia Walsh, take David Richardson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Patricia's voice was steady when she answered, "I do." The ring David slipped onto her finger belonged to his mother, a simple gold band that his father had worked extra shifts at the mine to afford 35 years earlier. David had spent the previous evening polishing it until it gleamed, thinking about the love story it represented and hoping it might bring similar luck to his own unconventional marriage. After the ceremony, Martha Henderson insisted on hosting a small celebration at the general store. She'd prepared a cake using precious sugar and eggs, and Bill had produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. Even Clara Martinez, who was known for her serious demeanor, seemed caught up in the festive atmosphere. "You did good, David," Clara said quietly as they stood watching Patricia laugh at something Martha was telling her. "That woman's got backbone, and she's going to need it out here. But she's also got heart, and that's rarer than backbone. How can you tell? The way she looks at you when you're holding the baby. She's not just grateful for the security you're providing. She's starting to care about you as a person. That's not something you can fake." David felt warmth spread through his chest at Clara's words. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd caught Patricia looking at him with expressions he couldn't quite decipher, but he'd been afraid to hope they meant anything beyond simple appreciation for his acceptance of her circumstances. Clara, David said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Shoot. How do you make a marriage work when it didn't start with love? When it's based on practical considerations rather than romance? Clara was quiet for a moment, watching as Patricia gently took Sarah from Martha's arms and settled the baby against her shoulder. You know, David, some of the strongest marriages I've seen started exactly like yours. When two people choose each other based on respect and shared goals instead of passion, they build something solid. Passion fades, but respect and partnership can grow into something deeper than most people ever experience. And if it doesn't grow into something deeper, then you'll still have respect and partnership, which is more than a lot of married couples can say. Clara's smile was knowing. But something tells me that's not going to be a problem for you two. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. Sarah slept in Patricia's arms, lulled by the rhythm of the wagon wheels, while Patricia and David both seemed lost in thought about the significance of what had just taken place. They were married now, legally bound to each other, and David found himself acutely aware of every detail, the way the afternoon light caught in Patricia's hair, the unconscious grace with which she adjusted her hold on Sarah, the faint scent of the wildflowers in her bouquet. Thank you, Patricia said suddenly as they approached the cabin. For what? For making today feel real. Like an actual wedding instead of just a legal formality. Patricia's voice was soft. Martha's cake, Clara riding all that way to be here, your mother's ring. You didn't have to do any of that. Yes, I did, David said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of their home. You deserve to have a real wedding day, Patricia. Both of you did. Patricia looked at him with that unreadable expression again, and David felt his pulse quicken. There was something different in her eyes now, something warmer and more open than he'd seen before. That evening, as they settled into their new routine as a married couple, David noticed subtle changes in the way Patricia moved through the cabin. She touched objects with more familiarity, straightened things with the proprietary air of someone who truly belonged there. When she hung her wedding dress carefully in the space David had cleared for her clothes, it felt like a declaration of permanence. David, Patricia said as they prepared for bed, with Sarah sleeping peacefully in her cradle. There's something I need to tell you. David felt his stomach drop. In his experience, conversations that began with those words rarely led anywhere good. What is it? Patricia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and David could see her gathering courage for whatever she needed to say. The uncle I mentioned in Boston, the one whose help came with conditions I wouldn't accept, he's been looking for me. Looking for you how? He hired someone to find me after I left Chicago. A detective of some kind. Patricia's voice was carefully controlled, but David could hear the fear underneath. He wants custody of Sarah. David felt ice form in his veins. On what grounds? He claims I'm an unfit mother because Sarah was born out of wedlock. He says he can provide a stable, respectable home for her, and that she'd be better off with his family than with a woman of questionable morals. But you're married now, David pointed out. That changes things, doesn't it? Patricia's smile was bitter. According to the last letter I received from his lawyer, a marriage of convenience to a stranger doesn't prove moral fitness. If anything, it demonstrates poor judgment and desperation. David felt anger building in his chest, hot and fierce. When was this letter? 3 days before I left Chicago. It's part of why I chose your offer over the others. Montana territory felt far enough away that he might not find me, at least not right away. Patricia, you should have told me this before we married. This affects both of us now. I know, and I'm sorry. But I was afraid that if you knew about the legal complications, you'd change your mind about the arrangement. David stood up and began pacing the small space, his mind racing through the implications. What exactly does he want? Just custody of Sarah, or is there something else? Patricia was quiet for so long that David stopped pacing and looked at her directly. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My parents left me a small inheritance when they died. Not much by most standards, but enough to be meaningful. It's held in trust until I turn 25, which is next year. My uncle is the trustee, and if he gains custody of Sarah, as her guardian, he would control the inheritance as well. He could claim it was being used for her benefit, but Patricia shrugged helplessly. David felt the pieces clicking into place. This isn't about Sarah's welfare at all. It's about money. Partly. But I also think he genuinely believes I'm unfit to raise her. He never approved of my relationship with Michael. And when I refused his offer to handle the situation when I first discovered I was pregnant, he made it clear that he considered me a disgrace to the family name. What kind of offer? Patricia's cheeks flushed, but she met David's gaze directly. He wanted to arrange for Sarah to be adopted by a respectable family, and for me to be sent to a home for wayward women until the scandal died down. He said if I agreed, he would continue to support me financially until I found a suitable husband from among his approved associates. The controlled fury David had been feeling exploded into something white-hot and dangerous. He wanted you to give up your daughter and let him sell you to the highest bidder. That's how I saw it too. David sat back down, closer to Patricia this time, and took her hands in his. They were trembling slightly, and he realized how much courage it had taken for her to tell him this. Patricia, I need you to understand something. No one is taking Sarah away from us. I don't care how much money your uncle has, or how many lawyers he hires. Sarah is our daughter now, legally and in every other way that matters. But if he finds us, he'll discover that Sarah Richardson is the daughter of a respectable rancher and his wife, living in a stable home with parents who love her. Any judge in Montana Territory would laugh him out of court. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. He has influence, connections. He could make things very difficult for us. Then we'll deal with it. David squeezed her hands gently. Together. That's what marriage means, Patricia. Facing problems together instead of alone. Even problems that aren't really yours. Sarah became mine the moment I held her. You became mine the moment you stepped off that stage, whether I understood it then or not. Your uncle can come if he wants, but he's going to find out that we're not the same desperate woman and helpless baby he tried to intimidate in Chicago. Patricia stared at him for a long moment, and David could see her processing his words, maybe beginning to believe that she truly wasn't alone anymore. There's something else, she said quietly. The detective he hired, I think he may have traced me as far as Billings. If he's still looking, he'll eventually check passenger manifests for stages heading into Montana Territory. David felt his jaw tighten. How much time do you think we have? I don't know. Maybe weeks, maybe months. Maybe he's already given up and decided I'm not worth the trouble. Or maybe he's already on his way here. David stood up again, his mind shifting into the practical mode that had kept him alive through 3 harsh Montana winters. Either way, we need to be prepared. What do you mean? I mean, we need to make sure that if anyone comes around asking questions, the people in Copper Creek know exactly who you are and how long you've been here. We need documentation of our marriage, of Sarah's situation, of your integration into the community. We need to make it clear that this isn't some desperate arrangement between strangers. It's a real family with real roots in this place. Patricia looked uncertain. How do we do that? We start by making sure everyone in town knows Mrs. Patricia Richardson and her daughter Sarah. We attend church services, participate in community events, and establish relationships with our neighbors. We make ourselves part of the fabric of this place so that if anyone comes asking about a runaway woman with a questionable past, they'll get nothing but blank stares. And if that's not enough, David walked over to where his rifle hung on the wall and checked to make sure it was loaded. Then your uncle's detective will discover that Montana Territory has its own ways of dealing with men who threaten women and children. Patricia's eyes widened. David, you can't. I won't start trouble, Patricia. But I won't let anyone take you or Sarah away from me either. This is our home, and we have the right to defend it. As if sensing the tension in the room, Sarah began to stir in her cradle, making the small sounds that usually preceded crying. Patricia immediately moved to comfort her, lifting the baby with practiced ease and beginning the gentle swaying motion that always seemed to settle her. "Shh, sweetheart," Patricia murmured. "Everything's all right. Mama's here, and Papa David's here, and nobody's going to hurt you." The word Papa hit David like a physical blow, sweet and fierce at the same time. He'd never expected to be anyone's father, had never even particularly wanted children. But listening to Patricia instinctively include him in Sarah's circle of protection made something shift permanently in his chest. "Can I hold her?" David asked softly. Patricia transferred Sarah to his arms without hesitation, and David marveled again at how perfectly the baby fit against his chest. Sarah looked up at him with those startling blue-green eyes, and David felt the same fierce protectiveness he'd experienced the first time he'd held her. "Your mama's right, little one," David said quietly. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Not your great-uncle, not his detective, not anyone. You're Richardson now, and Richardsons take care of their own." Patricia watched them with an expression David was beginning to recognize. Wonder mixed with gratitude, as if she couldn't quite believe that someone was willing to fight for her and her daughter. "David," she said softly, "why are you doing this? Really? You could have sent us away when you discovered Sarah. You could have gone through with the marriage, but drawn the line at getting involved in my legal troubles. Why are you willing to risk so much for people you barely know?" David considered the question seriously, looking down at Sarah's peaceful face as he formulated his answer. "Because 3 weeks ago, I was just surviving, going through the motions of living without any real purpose beyond keeping the ranch running and myself fed. But having you and Sarah here, it's given me something worth fighting for. A reason to build something that lasts instead of just getting by from one day to the next." He looked up at Patricia, meeting her gaze directly. "And because no child should grow up thinking she's unwanted or that her existence is something to be ashamed of. Sarah deserves to know that she's loved and valued, not just tolerated." Patricia's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked like tears of relief rather than fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," David said firmly, settling Sarah more comfortably in his arms. "Thank you for trusting me with your daughter's safety, for giving me a chance to be the man I always wanted to be but never knew how to become." As they prepared for bed that night, their first night as a legally married couple, David felt a sense of completeness he hadn't expected. The practical arrangement he'd envisioned had become something far more complex and meaningful, but also far more worthwhile. Outside, the Montana wind howled around the cabin, but inside, they were warm and safe and together. Whatever challenges Patricia's uncle might bring, whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would face them as a family, and that, David realized, made all the difference. Winter came early to Montana Territory that year, arriving with a vengeance in mid-December when a blizzard trapped the Richardson family inside their cabin for 4 consecutive days. David had never been more grateful for a woman's presence in his home. Where he might have gone stir-crazy from the confinement, Patricia seemed to bloom in the cozy domestic atmosphere, teaching him card games, sharing stories from her childhood, and maintaining a cheerful demeanor that made the enforced isolation feel less like captivity and more like an extended holiday. Sarah, now 6 months old, had developed into a remarkably social baby who seemed to thrive on the constant attention from both parents. She'd learned to sit up on her own, could grasp objects with startling accuracy, and had begun making sounds that almost resembled words. David found himself having actual conversations with her during his morning routine, explaining what he was doing as he fed the animals or chopped wood, while Sarah responded with enthusiastic babbling that seemed to indicate she understood every word. "You realize you're spoiling her," Patricia observed one morning as she watched David bouncing Sarah on his knee while drinking his coffee. "She's going to expect this level of entertainment from everyone she meets." "Good," David replied, making Sarah giggle by tickling her chin. She should expect to be treated like she's the most important person in the room, because she is. Patricia's smile was soft and warm, in a way that still caught David off guard. Over the past months, she'd relaxed considerably, the constant vigilance in her posture gradually giving way to something that looked almost like contentment. She'd put on weight, filling out the hollow places in her cheeks and adding curves to her previously gaunt frame. Her hair had regained its shine, and she'd started styling it in looser arrangements that softened her features. "David," Patricia said carefully, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." "What's that?" David replied, still focused on making faces at Sarah. "Why haven't you... That is, we've been married for 2 months now, and you've never tried to..." Patricia's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked away. "You've been very respectful, and I appreciate that, but I wondered if perhaps you were waiting for some kind of signal from me." David felt heat rush to his own face. The truth was, he'd been agonizing over this very question since their wedding night. He was intensely attracted to Patricia, more so with each passing day, as he watched her transform from the desperate woman who'd stepped off the stage into the confident, radiant woman sitting across from him. But he'd also been terrified of pushing too hard too fast, of making her feel that physical intimacy was an obligation rather than a choice. "I didn't want you to feel pressured," David said honestly. "I know our marriage started as a practical arrangement, and I didn't want to assume that just because we're legally husband and wife, you were ready for everything that usually entails." Patricia was quiet for a moment, watching as Sarah grabbed for David's coffee cup with determined little hands. "What if I told you I was ready?" she asked quietly. David's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to consider her words carefully. "Are you saying that because you think it's expected of you, or because you actually want to?" "I'm saying it because somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like a practical arrangement and started feeling like a real marriage." Patricia met his gaze directly. "And because I've fallen in love with my husband." The words hit David like a lightning strike, electrifying and transformative. He'd hoped for affection, maybe even genuine fondness over time, but he'd never dared to expect love. "Patricia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been in love with you since the day you trusted me enough to tell me about Sarah's father. Watching you with her, seeing how brave and strong and fiercely protective you are, it's been the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "So we're both idiots who've been tiptoeing around each other for months when we could have been honest about our feelings." "Apparently so," David agreed, reaching across the table to take her free hand. "Though I'd say we're idiots who've built something pretty wonderful together." Their moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, followed immediately by a voice David recognized as Tom Bradley, the stage driver. "David, are you there?" "Got an urgent message for you." David's blood turned to ice. Urgent messages in the middle of a Montana winter were never good news. He handed Sarah to Patricia and opened the door, letting in a blast of frigid air along with Tom, who was bundled in so many layers he looked like a walking pile of fur. "Tom, what the hell are you doing out in this weather?" David asked, helping the man stamp snow off his boots. "Got word from the telegraph office in Billings," Tom panted, pulling off his outer coat. "There's a fellow who has been asking around about a woman traveling with a baby, offering good money for information. Figured you might want to know." Patricia's face went white, and David felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had become his constant companion whenever Patricia's uncle was mentioned. "What kind of man?" David asked, keeping his voice level. "Well-dressed city type, according to the telegram. Claims to be a private investigator working for a family back east. Says the woman stole something valuable and they want it back." "Stole something?" Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. Tom looked uncomfortable. "Now, I don't believe a word of it, Mrs. Richardson. Anyone can see you're as honest as the day is long. But this fellow's got official-looking papers and enough money to make people talk. Thought you should know he's getting close. After Tom left, promising to keep his ears open and his mouth shut, David and Patricia sat in tense silence while Sarah played contentedly with a wooden spoon, oblivious to the crisis developing around her. "He's calling me a thief," Patricia said finally. "If he's spreading that story, people might believe him. They might think you're harboring a criminal. Let them think whatever they want," David said firmly. "The people who matter know who you really are. But David, if he has official-looking papers, then we'll get our own official papers. Tomorrow, weather permitting, I'm riding to Helena to speak with a lawyer. We're going to make sure that legally there's no question about Sarah's custody or your right to be here." Patricia shook her head. "You don't understand the kind of connections my uncle has. He knows judges, politicians, powerful businessmen. Out here we might seem legitimate, but if he can make this look like a federal matter, then we'll make sure it never gets that far." David's voice was grim with determination. "Patricia, I meant what I said before. No one is taking you or Sarah away from me. No one." The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every breath feel like swallowing knives. David prepared for the journey to Helena with methodical care, knowing that any mistake in winter travel could be fatal. He packed extra food, blankets, ammunition, and medical supplies, and made sure his horse was well rested and properly shod for the treacherous conditions. "I don't like you making this trip," Patricia said as she helped him load supplies into his saddlebags. "The weather's too dangerous, and if something happens to you, nothing's going to happen to me," David assured her, though privately he acknowledged the risks. "I've made this journey in worse conditions, and Clara Martinez is only 10 miles away if you need help with anything. How long will you be gone?" 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns bad again." David pulled Patricia close, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone you don't recognize. If anyone comes asking questions about you or Sarah, you don't know anything about any woman traveling with a baby. And if it's the detective himself," David's jaw tightened, "then you tell him that Mrs. Patricia Richardson has lived on this ranch for 6 months, that she's married to a local rancher, and that he's welcome to verify that information with anyone in Copper Creek. But you don't engage in any detailed conversation, and you don't let him in the house." The journey to Helena took David through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country in Montana Territory. The snow-covered peaks gleamed like diamonds in the winter sun, but the trails were icy and narrow, requiring constant attention to keep his horse from slipping. Several times, David had to dismount and lead the animal through particularly dangerous sections, his boots breaking through the snow crust with every step. But the physical challenges of the journey gave him time to think, to plan, and to consider all the angles of their situation. By the time he reached Helena, David had formulated a strategy that he hoped would protect his family while staying within the bounds of the law. The lawyer David sought out was a man named James Whitmore, recommended by the local banker as someone who understood both territorial law and federal jurisdiction issues. Whitmore's office was warm and well-appointed, a welcome contrast to the harsh conditions outside. "Mr. Richardson," Whitmore said after David had explained the situation, "what you're describing is not uncommon. Wealthy Eastern families often use private investigators to pursue what they claim are legal matters, but which are really attempts to control family members who've made choices they disapprove of. So you've seen cases like this before?" "Several. The good news is that territorial law tends to favor established residents over outside interference, especially when children are involved. The bad news is that if your wife's uncle has the kind of influence you describe, he may try to have the matter moved to federal jurisdiction." "On what grounds?" Whitmore leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Interstate transport of stolen property, if he can make the inheritance argument stick. Moral turpitude, if he can convince a federal judge that your wife's unmarried pregnancy constitutes evidence of unfit character. There are several creative legal theories he might pursue." David felt his stomach clench. "What do we do?" We get ahead of the situation. I'm going to prepare a comprehensive file documenting your wife's residency, your marriage, and the child's current situation. We'll get affidavits from local residents attesting to your wife's character and integration into the community. Most importantly, we'll establish that Sarah is legally your daughter through adoption proceedings. Adoption proceedings. Absolutely. Right now, your wife has sole custody of Sarah, which means her uncle could potentially challenge that custody. But if you formally adopt Sarah, she becomes your legal daughter with all the protections that entails. No Eastern judge is going to separate a child from her legal father without overwhelming evidence of abuse or neglect. David felt a surge of hope. How quickly can we make this happen? The paperwork can be prepared immediately. The formal proceedings will take a few weeks, but we can file preliminary motions that will establish your intent and create legal obstacles for anyone trying to interfere. As Whitmore began outlining the specific steps they needed to take, David felt some of the crushing weight of worry lift from his shoulders. They weren't helpless. They had options, legal protections, and most importantly, they had the truth on their side. The return journey to the ranch was even more treacherous than the trip to Helena, with new snow falling and wind creating whiteout conditions that forced David to take shelter twice. But the legal documents tucked safely in his saddlebags gave him strength to push through the worst of it, knowing that each mile brought him closer to Patricia and Sarah. When David finally reached the cabin, nearly 2 hours after dark on his third day away, he found Patricia pacing the floor with Sarah in her arms. The relief on her face when he walked through the door was so profound that David immediately knew something had happened. "Thank God you're back," Patricia breathed, launching herself into his arms, with Sarah caught safely between them. "I was so worried when you didn't arrive this afternoon." "The weather slowed me down," David explained, holding them both tightly. "But I have good news from Helena. We're going to be able to—" "Patricia, what's wrong? You're shaking." Patricia pulled back slightly, and David could see fear in her eyes that hadn't been there when he left. "He was here," she whispered. "The detective. He came yesterday morning." David felt ice form in his veins. "What happened? What did he say?" "He was very polite, very professional. Said he was investigating the disappearance of a woman named Patricia Walsh and her infant daughter from Chicago. He had a photograph." "A photograph of what?" Patricia's voice was barely audible. "Of me, taken some time before Sarah was born. I don't know how he got it, but it was definitely me." David's mind raced through the implications. If the detective had a photograph, he could show it to people in town, could potentially identify Patricia despite her married name and changed circumstances. "What did you tell him?" "Exactly what you said. That I was Mrs. Patricia Richardson, that I'd lived here for 6 months, and that he was welcome to verify that with anyone in town." "But David," Patricia's voice broke slightly, "he knew things. About Michael, about the circumstances of Sarah's birth, about my uncle's offer to handle the situation. He knows everything." David pulled Patricia closer, feeling her trembling against his chest. "It doesn't matter what he knows. What matters is what he can prove and what the law will support. Did you find a lawyer?" "I found the best lawyer in Helena, and he's confident we can protect our family." David pulled back to look at Patricia directly. "We're going to formally adopt Sarah. Once that's done, she'll be legally my daughter, and no court in the country will separate her from us without cause." For the first time since he'd walked through the door, Patricia's expression showed hope instead of fear. "Really? Is that possible?" "It's not just possible, it's happening. The papers are already being prepared." David touched Sarah's cheek gently, and the baby immediately turned toward his hand with a smile. "In a few weeks, this little girl will officially be Sarah Rose Richardson, the daughter of David and Patricia Richardson of Montana Territory." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than fear. "I love you," she whispered. "Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." "We love you too," David replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. And we're going to fight for this family with everything we have. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, but inside, they were warm and safe and together. Whatever challenges the detective and Patricia's uncle might bring, whatever legal battles lay ahead, they would face them united, and that, David knew, made them stronger than any outside threat. The detective's name was Jonathan Hartwell, and he had the unsettling ability to appear anywhere in Copper Creek without warning. Over the next week, David spotted him outside Henderson's general store, lingering near the church after Sunday services, and even sitting in the saloon nursing a whiskey while engaging other patrons in seemingly casual conversation. Each sighting made David's jaw clench tighter, but Hartwell was careful never to do anything overtly threatening or illegal. He's building a case, Patricia said one evening as they watched through the cabin window, while Hartwell rode slowly past their property for the third time that day. Gathering evidence, talking to people, documenting everything he can about our situation. Sarah, now 7 months old and increasingly active, was crawling around the cabin floor with determined purpose, occasionally pulling herself up to standing position, using furniture for support. She seemed completely unaware of the tension surrounding her, babbling cheerfully and clapping her hands whenever David or Patricia looked in her direction. Let him gather all the evidence he wants, David replied grimly. Every day that passes makes our case stronger. Every witness who can testify that you've been Mrs. Patricia Richardson for months, that Sarah is thriving in our care, that we're a legitimate family, it all works in our favor. The adoption papers had arrived from Helena the previous day, and David had spent hours going through them with Patricia, making sure she understood every legal nuance. The formal hearing was scheduled for the first week of February, just 3 weeks away. If they could hold off any interference until then, Sarah would be legally protected in ways that even Patricia's wealthy uncle couldn't easily challenge. But Hartwell wasn't making it easy. David learned from Tom Bradley that the detective had been asking pointed questions about the timing of Patricia's arrival, about whether anyone remembered seeing her before October, about the circumstances of their hasty marriage. So far, the responses had been uniformly supportive. Martha Henderson had apparently told Hartwell that Patricia was the finest woman to settle in these parts in years, and even gruff Bill Henderson had praised David's good fortune in finding such a capable wife. The problem is, Patricia said, settling into the chair by the fire with a cup of tea, he doesn't need to prove I'm unfit or that our marriage is fake. He just needs to create enough doubt about the legitimacy of our situation to convince a judge that Sarah would be better off with my uncle's family. And how does he plan to do that? Patricia was quiet for a moment, watching Sarah attempt to eat a wooden block she'd picked up from the floor. By painting me as a desperate woman who seduced an innocent rancher to avoid losing her child. By suggesting that you're being manipulated and don't understand what you're really involved in. By making it look like Sarah is being used as a pawn in some elaborate deception. David felt anger surge through him. None of that is true. No, but it doesn't have to be true to be effective. All he needs is to create reasonable doubt about our motives and circumstances. That night, David made a decision that he didn't discuss with Patricia until after he'd already acted on it. He rode to Clara Martinez's homestead and spent 2 hours explaining the situation in detail, asking for her help in ways that went beyond simple neighborly support. What you're asking is dangerous, David, Clara said after he'd finished outlining his plan. If this goes wrong, you could end up in jail. And if I don't act, I could end up losing my family, David replied. Clara, I need to know what Hartwell is really after, what kind of evidence he's gathering, what his timeline looks like. You're the only person I trust who has the skills to find out. Clara Martinez had come to Montana Territory under circumstances she rarely discussed, but David knew she'd once worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Before deciding, she preferred the relative honesty of frontier life to the moral ambiguities of private investigation. Her ability to move unnoticed through a community and gather information was legendary among the local ranchers, who often consulted her when they needed to know which of their hands might be stealing cattle or selling information to competitors. "I'll do what I can," Clara said finally. "But David, you need to understand that if Hartwell is as good as you say he is, he'll eventually figure out what I'm doing. That could make things worse for you and Patricia." "Things are already as bad as they can get," David replied. "At least this way we'll know what we're really facing." Clara's investigation yielded results within 3 days. She appeared at the Richardson cabin just after dawn, her horse lathered with sweat from a hard ride. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "All of us. This is bigger than you thought." Patricia paled at Clara's tone, but she poured coffee without comment, while Clara settled herself at the kitchen table. Sarah, sensing the seriousness of the adult's mood, stayed unusually quiet in Patricia's arms. "Hartwell isn't just gathering information for your uncle," Clara began. "He's working with a federal marshal who's been investigating what they're calling an interstate kidnapping case." David felt the blood drain from his face. "Kidnapping? According to the documents I managed to see, your uncle has filed a complaint claiming that Patricia abducted Sarah from Chicago to prevent him from exercising his legal rights as the child's closest male relative. He's arguing that since Sarah's father is dead and Patricia was never married to him, custody should default to the family patriarch. "But that's not how the law works," Patricia protested. "A mother has rights, not according to the legal theory they're pursuing. They're claiming that because you weren't married to Sarah's father, you have no more legal standing than any other woman who might claim to be her mother. They're saying that blood relatives should take precedence over an unmarried woman of questionable moral character." David felt rage building in his chest, white-hot and dangerous. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "It's ridiculous, but it's not necessarily wrong under certain interpretations of federal law," Clara continued grimly. "And here's the worst part. They're planning to act before your adoption hearing. Hartwell has already sent word back east that he's located you. A federal marshal is supposedly already en route to Montana Territory, with papers authorizing Sarah's removal to federal custody, pending a full hearing in Chicago." Patricia made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "They're going to take her." "Not if we don't let them," David said firmly, though his mind was racing through increasingly desperate possibilities. Clara leaned forward. "David, you need to understand what you're really facing here. If federal marshals show up with proper paperwork, you can't legally resist. If you try to hide Sarah or refuse to turn her over, you'll be guilty of federal crimes that could put you in prison for years. And if I don't resist, they'll take her back to Chicago and I'll never see her again." "There might be another way," Clara said slowly, "but it would require you to trust me completely and be willing to take some significant risks." David and Patricia exchanged glances. "What kind of risks?" Patricia asked. "The kind that could get us all arrested if we're caught, but that might be your only chance to keep Sarah." Clara's plan was audacious in its simplicity. If federal marshals were coming to arrest Patricia and remove Sarah from their custody, the key was to make sure they couldn't find them when they arrived. But instead of running, which would make them fugitives and eventually lead to capture, Clara proposed a different approach. "There's a network of people throughout the territory who help folks disappear when they need to," Clara explained. "Mostly it's been used for people fleeing abusive situations or avoiding unjust legal troubles. But it could work for you, too. You're talking about hiding us permanently?" Patricia asked. "I'm talking about hiding you long enough for the legal situation to change in your favor." "David, you said the lawyer in Helena was confident about the adoption proceedings. If we can keep Sarah out of federal custody until those are complete, the marshals will find themselves trying to remove a legally adopted daughter from her legal father. That's a much harder case for them to make." David felt a spark of hope. "How long would we need to stay hidden?" "A month, maybe 6 weeks at most." long enough for the adoption to be finalized and for the federal authorities to realize they're dealing with a much more complicated legal situation than your uncle led them to believe. And if we're caught, Clara's expression was grim, then you'll face federal charges for evading lawful arrest, and I'll probably join you in prison for aiding and abetting. But David, if you don't try something, you're going to lose Sarah anyway. At least this way, you have a fighting chance. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. David looked at Patricia holding Sarah, at the life they'd built together in their small cabin, at the future they'd planned as a family. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, losing Sarah to Patricia's manipulative uncle, was unthinkable. What do we need to do? David asked. Clara's plan unfolded over the next 2 days with military precision. David would remain at the ranch, maintaining the appearance of normal life while claiming that Patricia and Sarah had gone to visit relatives in another territory. Meanwhile, Patricia and Sarah would be hidden in a series of safe houses throughout Montana Territory, moving every few days to avoid detection. The first hiding place was a cabin belonging to a widow named Ellen Morrison. Located in a remote valley 30 miles north of Copper Creek, Ellen had lost her husband in a mining accident 2 years earlier and now lived alone with her teenage son, surviving on a combination of hunting, trapping, and occasional work in town. She agreed to shelter Patricia and Sarah without asking questions about their circumstances. "I know what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn," Ellen said simply when Clara brought them to her cabin. "You're welcome here, as long as you need to stay." The cabin was smaller and more primitive than what Patricia had grown accustomed to, but it was warm and secure, with Ellen's son Jake providing an extra layer of protection. Jake, at 16, was already bigger than most grown men and had inherited his father's protective instincts along with his impressive physical presence. Patricia's first night away from David was the hardest either of them had endured since their marriage. David lay awake in their empty cabin, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he'd made the right choice. Patricia, holding Sarah in Ellen Morrison's spare room, felt more alone and vulnerable than she had since stepping off the stage in Copper Creek months earlier. But their separation served its purpose. When Jonathan Hartwell and 2 federal marshals arrived at the Richardson Ranch 3 days later, they found only David, who calmly explained that his wife and daughter had gone to visit Patricia's cousin in Wyoming Territory and weren't expected back for several weeks. "That's convenient timing," Hartwell observed suspiciously. "Not really," David replied evenly. "Patricia's been planning this visit since before Christmas. Her cousin just had a baby and needed help getting through the winter. I have letters documenting the arrangements, if you'd like to see them." The letters, provided by Clara Martinez's mysterious network, were authentic-looking enough to give the marshals pause. Without concrete evidence that David was lying and facing the prospect of a long, expensive journey to Wyoming Territory to verify his story, they decided to establish a temporary headquarters in Copper Creek while they investigated further. This bought Patricia and Sarah precious time, but it also created new dangers. With federal marshals actively searching for them, every day of hiding increased the risk of discovery. Ellen Morrison's cabin might be remote, but it wasn't invisible, and the longer Patricia stayed there, the more likely it became that someone would notice unusual activity in the area. After a week at Ellen's cabin, Clara moved Patricia and Sarah to their second hiding place, a hunting lodge belonging to a family of trappers who spent most of their time in the high country. The lodge was even more isolated than Ellen's cabin, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that would be impassable once the next major snowstorm hit. "How much longer do you think this will take?" Patricia asked Clara during one of her brief visits to check on their welfare. "The adoption hearing is still 3 weeks away," Clara replied. "After that, we'll need another week or 2 for the paperwork to be processed and filed. So maybe a month total." A month felt like an eternity to Patricia, who worried constantly about David facing the marshals alone and about the impact their forced separation was having on their marriage. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the adventure. treating each new hiding place as an exciting game and charming everyone they met with her increasingly adventurous personality. She's going to be a handful when she gets older. Ellen Morrison had observed during their stay at her cabin. That child has no fear and way too much curiosity for her own good. It was Sarah's fearless curiosity that nearly led to their discovery during their second week at the hunting lodge. Patricia had been hanging laundry behind the cabin when Sarah, who had learned to crawl with alarming speed and determination, disappeared around the corner of the building. Patricia found her 20 feet away, cheerfully eating snow, while a pair of unfamiliar horses stood nearby. The horses belonged to two men Patricia didn't recognize, and her heart stopped when she realized they were asking the trapper's wife about whether she'd seen any strangers in the area. Recently, federal marshals. The woman explained quietly after the men had left without spotting Patricia or Sarah. They're checking every cabin, every homestead, every place someone might hide a woman and baby. You can't stay here much longer. That night, huddled in the lodge's main room with Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms, Patricia made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't keep running indefinitely, couldn't keep putting innocent people at risk by asking them to hide her. More importantly, she couldn't keep David and herself separated during what might be the most crucial period of their marriage. If they were going to fight for their family, they needed to fight together. When Clara arrived the next morning to discuss moving them to yet another hiding place, she found Patricia packing their few belongings with grim determination. "We're going home," Patricia announced. "Whatever happens, we're going to face it together." Clara stared at her. "Patricia, that's suicide. The marshals are watching David's place constantly. If you show up there, they'll arrest you immediately. Then we'd better make sure they have a very good reason not to," Patricia replied. "Clara, I need you to get a message to James Whitmore in Helena. Tell him we're ready to force this issue into court, and that we need him to meet us in Copper Creek with every legal weapon at his disposal." "Patricia, I'm not running anymore," Patricia said firmly, looking down at Sarah's sleeping face. "This is my daughter, David is my husband, and Montana Territory is my home. If my uncle wants a fight, he's going to get one." As Clara rode away to deliver Patricia's message, Patricia began the journey back to Copper Creek with Sarah in her arms and determination in her heart. Whatever the federal marshals had planned, whatever legal challenges awaited them, she and David would face them as a family. The time for hiding was over. Patricia's return to Copper Creek created a sensation that rippled through the small community like wildfire. She didn't sneak back under cover of darkness or attempt to avoid the federal marshals who had been watching David's ranch for 2 weeks. Instead, she rode down the main street at noon on a borrowed horse, carrying Sarah in a sling across her chest and wearing an expression of such fierce determination that even hardened frontiermen stepped aside to let her. Parcel Marshal Theodore Blackwood was drinking coffee at Henderson's general store when word reached him that Patricia Richardson had just arrived in town. A career lawman with 20 years of federal service, Blackwood had dealt with everything from bank robbers to cattle rustlers, but he'd never encountered a situation quite like this one. His orders were clear: arrest Patricia Walsh for interstate kidnapping and transport both her and the child back to Chicago for federal prosecution. But the woman who had just ridden into town bore little resemblance to the desperate fugitive described in his paperwork. "That's her," confirmed Jonathan Hartwell, pointing through the store window as Patricia dismounted in front of the town's small courthouse. "Patricia Walsh, wanted for kidnapping her own child." "She doesn't look much like a kidnapper," observed Martha Henderson, who had been listening to the conversation with growing indignation. "She looks like a mother protecting her baby from folks who want to steal her away." Marshal Blackwood studied Patricia through the window as she secured her horse and adjusted Sarah's position in the sling. The child appeared healthy and content, babbling cheerfully and reaching for her mother's face with obvious affection. This was not the scene of trauma and desperation he'd expected to find. "Mrs. Henderson," Blackwood said carefully, How long have you known Mrs. Richardson? Since she arrived in October to marry David. Finest woman to settle in these parts in years, and that's the truth of it. Take good care of that baby, help her neighbors, never cause a moment's trouble for anyone. And the child. Have you noticed any signs of distress or unhealthy attachment? Martha's laugh was sharp and dismissive. That baby adores her mama and her papa both. Happiest little thing you ever saw. If you're looking for evidence of kidnapping, Marshall, you're barking up the wrong tree entirely. Before Blackwood could respond, David Richardson strode through the store's front door with an energy that immediately commanded attention. He'd seen Patricia's arrival from his position across the street and had wasted no time crossing to intercept whatever confrontation was brewing. "Marshal Blackwood," David said with careful politeness, "I understand you've been looking for my wife. She's back from visiting her cousin in Wyoming Territory, as I mentioned she would be." "Mr. Richardson," Blackwood replied, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The woman you married is wanted on federal charges related to the abduction of a minor child from Illinois. The woman I married is Patricia Richardson, mother to my legally adopted daughter Sarah Rose Richardson," David countered smoothly. "I have the adoption papers right here, filed with the territorial court just this morning." The silence that followed David's statement was profound. Hartwell's face went pale, while Marshal Blackwood looked genuinely confused. "That's impossible," Hartwell sputtered. "Those adoption proceedings weren't scheduled for another 2 weeks. Emergency hearings can be convened when circumstances warrant," came a new voice from the doorway. James Whitmore, the lawyer from Helena, stepped into the store carrying a leather satchel that obviously contained important documents. "Judge Morrison reviewed the case yesterday and approved an expedited adoption based on evidence of imminent threat to the child's welfare." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Mr. Whitmore, I presume. I'm afraid your emergency adoption doesn't supersede federal authority in this matter. I still have orders to arrest Patricia Walsh and transport her to Chicago." "You're welcome to try," Whitmore replied calmly, "but you'll find yourself attempting to arrest Mrs. Patricia Richardson, a legally married resident of Montana Territory, for the supposed kidnapping of her husband's legally adopted daughter. I suspect that's going to create some interesting jurisdictional complications. The legal maneuvering might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by an unexpected voice from the store's entrance. "Well, this is certainly more dramatic than I anticipated." Everyone turned to see a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, impeccably dressed despite the long journey from the east. He had Patricia's dark hair, though his was streaked with silver, and the same intelligent eyes that had drawn David's attention when he first met his wife. Patricia's reaction to seeing the man was immediate and visceral. She stepped backward instinctively, clutching Sarah more tightly to her chest, and David saw fear flash across her face for the first time since her return to town. "Uncle Charles," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles Ashford removed his hat with theatrical politeness and surveyed the crowded store with obvious amusement. "Patricia, my dear niece, you've led us on quite a chase. Though I must admit, the Montana Territory is more civilized than I expected." "Mr. Ashford," Marshal Blackwood said, stepping forward, "I wasn't expecting you to make the journey personally. When family is involved, Marshal, personal attention becomes necessary." Ashford's gaze settled on Sarah, who was staring at this new stranger with curious eyes. "And there she is, my great-niece Sarah. She's grown considerably since the photographs I received from Chicago." "You have no right to be here," Patricia said, finding her voice despite the obvious fear. "Sarah is my daughter, and she's happy and safe where she is." "My dear girl," Ashford replied with condescending gentleness, "a child born out of wedlock to an unmarried woman has no legal protection from family intervention, especially when that woman has demonstrated such poor judgment in her personal affairs." It was David who stepped forward, placing himself between Ashford and Patricia with deliberate intent. "Mr. Ashford, allow me to introduce myself. I'm David Richardson, Patricia's husband and Sarah's adoptive father. And in Montana territory, we don't take kindly to strangers threatening our families. Ashford's eyebrows rose with apparent interest. Ah, the rancher. I've heard about your arrangement with my niece. Tell me, Mr. Richardson, did Patricia mention the inheritance she stands to receive on her 25th birthday? Approximately $15,000 held in trust by my bank. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. David felt every eye in the store turning toward him, and he realized that Ashford was attempting to paint their marriage as a mercenary scheme designed to gain access to Patricia's money. I know about the inheritance, David said calmly. Patricia told me about it, along with your attempts to control her through it. What she didn't tell me was how much it was worth, because frankly, I don't care. My interest in your niece has nothing to do with money. How noble, Ashford said with obvious skepticism. And I suppose you were equally indifferent to the fact that marrying her would give you legal standing to challenge any custody arrangements I might pursue. No, David replied honestly. I wasn't indifferent to that. I married Patricia because I love her and because I wanted to. Protect her and Sarah from people like you, who see children as pawns in financial games. Sarah chose that moment to make her presence known with a loud, cheerful babble that drew everyone's attention. She was reaching toward David with obvious expectation, and when he took her from Patricia's arms, she settled against his chest with the contentment of a child who knew exactly where she belonged. As you can see, Whitmore interjected smoothly, Sarah has formed strong attachments to both her parents. Any attempt to disrupt this family unit would clearly be detrimental to her welfare. Her welfare, Ashford replied coldly, would be best served by being raised in a proper household with adequate resources and moral guidance. Not in some frontier cabin by people who barely know each other. These people have created a loving home for that child, Martha Henderson said hotly, unable to contain her indignation any longer. Anyone with eyes can see how happy and healthy she is. What kind of man tries to take a baby away from parents who love her? The kind of man who understands legal responsibility and family obligation, Ashford replied smoothly. Mrs. Henderson. And I've seen enough family obligations in my time to know the difference between duty and greed. The tension in the room was becoming palpable, with the various factions clearly drawn. Marshal Blackwood looked increasingly uncomfortable with his position, while Hartwell seemed to be realizing that the simple kidnapping case he'd been hired to investigate had become something far more complex. It was Judge Morrison who broke the deadlock by entering the store with his usual no-nonsense demeanor. A territorial judge for 15 years, Morrison had a reputation for cutting through legal complications with practical wisdom and frontier common sense. Well, Morrison said, surveying the crowded room, I see my emergency adoption hearing has attracted quite an audience. Mr. Ashford, I assume? I received your telegrams challenging my authority in this matter. Judge Morrison, Ashford replied with cool politeness, I believe there are serious questions about the legitimacy of these proceedings. My niece appears to have manipulated the legal system to avoid proper family oversight of her child. Mr. Ashford, I've reviewed every document in this case, including the correspondence between your attorneys and various federal agencies. I've also interviewed witnesses to Mrs. Richardson's character and her relationship with the child in question. Would you like to know my findings? Ashford's confident expression flickered slightly. I would be interested in your perspective. Your Honor. Morrison walked over to where David was holding Sarah, and the judge's stern expression softened noticeably as the baby smiled at him and reached for his badge. My finding is that Sarah Rose Richardson is a healthy, happy child who has been excellently cared for by parents who clearly adore her. My further finding is that any attempt to remove her from this home would constitute child abuse, regardless of the legal technicalities involved. Your Honor, Hartwell interjected. Federal law supersedes territorial authority in cases involving interstate. Mr. Hartwell, Morrison interrupted sharply. Federal law also requires evidence of actual harm to a child before families can be separated. Can you present any evidence that Sarah has been harmed by her current living situation? Hartwell looked helplessly at Ashford, who was beginning to realize that his carefully planned legal strategy was unraveling. The harm, Your Honor, lies in allowing the child to remain with people who obtained custody through deception and fraud, Ashford said, his polished facade beginning to crack. My niece deliberately concealed her pregnancy and the child's existence to prevent proper family intervention. And why? Morrison asked pointedly. Did she feel the need to conceal her circumstances from her family? The question hung in the air with devastating effect. Patricia, who had been silent during most of the confrontation, finally found her voice. Because when I told my uncle I was pregnant and needed help, he offered to arrange for Sarah to be adopted by strangers and for me to be committed to an institution until the scandal passed, she said clearly. Because he made it clear that his help depended on my giving up my daughter and allowing him to choose my future husband from among his business associates. A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Even Marshal Blackwood looked disturbed by Patricia's revelation. That's a gross mischaracterization, Ashford protested. I offered to help Patricia through a difficult situation in a way that would preserve both her reputation and the family's standing. By taking her child away and selling her like livestock, David said, his voice deadly quiet, by providing structure and guidance to a young woman who had clearly demonstrated an inability to make appropriate decisions, Ashford shot back. Judge Morrison had heard enough. Mr. Ashford, based on everything I've seen and heard today, I'm satisfied that Sarah Richardson is exactly where she belongs. The adoption is finalized, the family is legitimate, and this court will not be party to separating a child from loving parents to satisfy someone else's idea of propriety. This isn't over, Ashford said, his composure finally cracking completely. I have resources, connections, and influence that extends far beyond this provincial territory. That child is blood kin, and she belongs with a family who can provide for her future. It was Sarah herself who provided the final word on the matter. From her secure position in David's arms, she looked directly at her great-uncle and began to cry, not the fussing of a tired or hungry baby, but the genuine distress of a child confronted with something that frightened her. David immediately began the gentle bouncing and soft murmuring that always calmed her, while Patricia moved closer to add her own comforting presence. There's your answer. Mr. Ashford, Judge Morrison said quietly, that child knows who her family is, and it isn't you. As the various officials and lawyers began filing out of the store, each with their own legal complications to sort through, Patricia and David found themselves alone with Sarah for the first time in weeks. The relief of being together again was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that their legal battles were far from over. Is it really finished? Patricia asked, watching through the window as her uncle climbed into an expensive carriage for the journey back to the railroad station. This part is finished, David replied, shifting Sarah to a more comfortable position. But your uncle was right about one thing. He has resources and connections we can't match. He'll try other approaches, other legal strategies. Then what do we do? David looked at his wife and daughter, at the life they'd built together despite impossible odds, and felt the same fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision since Patricia stepped off that stage 5 months ago. We do what we've always done, he said simply. We take care of each other. We build our life together one day at a time. And we trust that love is stronger than money or influence or legal manipulation. Patricia smiled through her tears, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she looked genuinely hopeful about their future. I love you, David Richardson, she said softly. I love you too, Patricia Richardson, he replied. Both of you, and that's something your uncle's money can never buy or destroy. Outside, the Montana wind carried the promise of spring, and inside Henderson's general store, A family that had been forged in desperation and tested by adversity finally began to believe they might actually survive everything the world could throw at them. 3 years after Charles Ashford's failed attempt to claim custody of Sarah, the Richardson Ranch had transformed into something David could never have imagined when he first placed his advertisement in those eastern newspapers. The original cabin had been expanded twice, with a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, and a nursery that currently housed not just 3-year-old Sarah Rose, but also 18-month-old Michael David Richardson and 2-month-old Emma Claire Richardson. Patricia stood at the kitchen window, watching David teach Sarah how to help feed the chickens, while baby Emma slept peacefully in a cradle David had crafted from Montana pine. The scene filled her with a contentment so profound it sometimes took her breath away. This was the life she'd never dared to dream of during those desperate months in Chicago. A loving husband, healthy children, and a home where she truly belonged. The legal battles with her uncle had continued sporadically over the years, taking various forms as Ashford exhausted different avenues of attack. He'd challenged the validity of their marriage, questioned the legitimacy of Sarah's adoption, and even attempted to have Patricia declared mentally incompetent to make decisions about her inheritance. Each legal assault had been more expensive and time-consuming than the last, but also less effective as the Richardson family's roots in Montana. Territory grew deeper in their community. Support became unshakable. The inheritance itself had finally been resolved on Patricia's 25th birthday. When she'd gained full legal control of the money her parents had left her. Her first act had been to donate half of it to establish a fund for widows and orphaned children in Copper Creek, effectively demonstrating to any remaining skeptics that her motivations had never been financial. The remainder she'd invested in expanding the ranch and purchasing adjoining land, making David one of the most successful cattlemen in the territory. More than anything else, Patricia had told David on the night she received the inheritance, "I want this money to build something good for our children, something that honors my parents' memory and shows them we can create a better world than the one that tried to tear us apart." Sarah had grown into a spirited child who combined her mother's intelligence with her father's practical nature and an adventurous streak that kept both parents constantly vigilant. At 3, she could already ride a gentle horse, help with simple ranch chores, and charm visitors with a vocabulary that impressed everyone who met her. She had no memory of the custody battles that had dominated her first year of life, knowing only that she was Sarah Richardson, beloved daughter of David and Patricia, protective big sister to Michael and Emma. Michael, meanwhile, had inherited David's quiet strength and Patricia's curiosity about the world around him. At 18 months, he was already showing signs of the analytical mind that would serve him well in whatever path he chose to follow. He adored his older sister, followed his father around the ranch whenever possible, and possessed a sunny disposition that made him a favorite with everyone in Copper Creek. Baby Emma was still too young to show much personality beyond the Richardson family's apparent gift for contentment and the distinctive blue-green eyes that seemed to run in David's line. But Patricia had already noticed that Emma possessed a particular intensity when she studied faces, as if she was filing away important information for future use. The transformation in Patricia herself was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The desperate, frightened woman who had stepped off that stage with hollow eyes and worn-out boots had become a confident ranch wife whose opinion was sought on everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. She served on the school board, organized community events, and had become the unofficial medical practitioner for families within a day's ride of Copper Creek. Her knowledge, gained through necessity and expanded through voracious reading of medical texts David ordered for her from back east, had saved several lives and earned her a reputation that extended far beyond their local community. Mrs. Richardson, people would say when introducing her to visitors. Delivered my youngest, fixed my husband's broken leg, and made the best apple preserves in the territory. It was exactly the kind of reputation Patricia had always wanted, based on competence and contribution rather than scandal and speculation. David had flourished as well, growing from a solitary rancher going through the motions of life into a respected community leader whose advice was valued and whose friendship was treasured. He'd been elected to the Territorial Council twice, had helped establish the first real school in Copper Creek, and had become known throughout Montana Territory as a man whose word was absolute and whose loyalty was unwavering. But perhaps more importantly, he'd discovered that he was a natural father who genuinely enjoyed the chaos and wonder of raising children. Whether he was teaching Sarah to identify different bird calls, helping Michael stack blocks into increasingly elaborate towers, or simply rocking Emma to sleep in the evening, David approached fatherhood with the same methodical care and deep affection he brought to everything he truly cared about. "Sometimes I can't believe this is my life," Patricia said one evening as they sat on the porch after putting all 3 children to bed. "5 years ago, I was alone and terrified, convinced I'd never have a real home or family. Now look at us." "No," David replied, pulling her closer against his side. "Look at you. You built this, Patricia. Your courage, your determination to fight for Sarah, your willingness to trust a stranger with your future. That's what made everything else possible." "We built this," Patricia corrected. "I provided the courage, but you provided the foundation. None of this would exist without a man who was willing to love a woman and child who weren't his responsibility." They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the ranch, unusual at that time of evening, but not alarming. David had learned to distinguish between different types of approaching riders: neighbors in need, travelers seeking shelter, or potential trouble, and these horses carried the steady rhythm of people who knew where they were going and weren't in a hurry to get there. 2 riders emerged from the dusk, and Patricia felt her heart skip when she recognized one of them. Clara Martinez, now in her 50s, but still straight-backed and sharp-eyed, dismounted with the fluid grace that had never left her despite the years. Her companion was a woman Patricia didn't recognize, younger and clearly Eastern in her dress and manner. "Clara," David called out, rising to greet their unexpected visitors. "What brings you out so late?" "Business," Clara replied with characteristic brevity. "This is Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, Jonathan Hartwell's niece. She's got something to say that I think you'll want to hear." The name Hartwell sent a chill through Patricia, but the woman who stepped forward bore little resemblance to the detective who had pursued them years earlier. She was perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes and an air of nervous determination that reminded Patricia uncomfortably of herself during those desperate months in Chicago. "Mr. and Mrs. Richardson," Elizabeth Hartwell said, "I owe you an apology on behalf of my family, and I have information you need to know about Charles Ashford." Patricia and David exchanged glances. They hadn't heard from or about Patricia's uncle in over a year, and had begun to hope that he'd finally given up his various legal campaigns against their family. "What kind of information?" Patricia asked carefully. Elizabeth took a deep breath, clearly gathering courage for what she needed to say. "My uncle Jonathan kept detailed records of all his investigations, including the work he did for Mr. Ashford. Before he died last month, he made me promise to bring you these." She handed Patricia a leather portfolio filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be correspondence. Patricia opened it with trembling hands, and her face went pale as she began reading. "What is it?" David asked, moving to look over her shoulder. "Evidence," Patricia whispered. "Jonathan Hartwell documented everything. Every lie my uncle told about my circumstances, every law he tried to bend or break, every bribe he offered to officials who wouldn't cooperate with his plans." David scanned the documents with growing amazement. "Patricia, this proves that your uncle committed fraud, attempted bribery, and filed false statements with federal authorities. This could send him to prison." "That's not all," Elizabeth continued. There are similar documents relating to other cases, other women whose inheritances or children Mr. Ashford pursued through questionable legal means. My uncle became convinced that Ashford was operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise, using private investigators and corrupt officials to steal from vulnerable women. Clara, who had been listening with her usual focused attention, spoke up. The question is, what do you want to do with this information? You could have Ashford arrested and prosecuted, but that would mean testifying in court, reliving all the old accusations, exposing your family to public scrutiny again. Patricia looked at the evidence that could finally give her complete victory over the man who had terrorized her for years, then glanced back at the house where her 3 children slept peacefully. The irony wasn't lost on her. She finally had the power to destroy Charles Ashford, but she no longer needed it. You know what? Patricia said, closing the portfolio with deliberate finality. I don't want revenge anymore. What I want is for other women in situations like mine to have the help I didn't have. Elizabeth, would your uncle's evidence be useful in helping other victims of similar schemes? Elizabeth's face lit up with understanding. Yes, absolutely. There are several active cases involving women who are fighting exactly the kind of legal manipulation you faced. This evidence could help them win their battles and expose the network of people who prey on vulnerable families. Then that's what we'll do with it, Patricia decided. Use it to help other women, but leave my uncle alone. He's a bitter old man who's already lost everything that really mattered. Living with that knowledge is punishment enough. David squeezed Patricia's hand, understanding immediately why she'd made that choice. The woman he'd married had been driven by desperation and fear. The woman she'd become was motivated by compassion and strength. She no longer needed to defeat Charles Ashford because she'd already won something far more valuable, a life built on love rather than bitterness. There's one more thing, Elizabeth said hesitantly. Mr. Ashford's health has been declining rapidly. His doctors don't expect him to live much longer. He's been asking about Sarah, wondering if she's happy, if she's been well cared for. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. What do you think he wants? I think he wants to know that he was wrong, Elizabeth said softly. That you made the right choice. That Sarah is better off with you than she would have been with him. And what do you think I should tell him? Elizabeth smiled, and Patricia could see genuine warmth in her expression. I think you should tell him the truth. Sarah Richardson is a happy, healthy, beloved child who's growing up in a family that adores her. That she's surrounded by people who will always put her welfare above their own interests. And that you've built exactly the kind of life for her that any parent would want. As Clara and Elizabeth prepared to leave, carrying with them the evidence that would help other women fight battles similar to Patricia's, Patricia found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she'd been a desperate woman with no options, fleeing from a man who saw her child as property to be claimed. Now she had the power to destroy that same man, but chose instead to use her strength to help others. No regrets? David asked as they watched their visitors ride away into the Montana night. Patricia considered the question seriously, thinking about all the pain and fear and uncertainty that had led them to this point. None, she said finally. Every terrible thing that happened brought us to where we are now. I wouldn't change any of it, because changing it might mean losing this. She gestured toward the house where their children slept, toward the land they'd built their life on, toward the community that had become their extended family. Besides, Patricia added with a smile, I got exactly what I answered your advertisement for, a partner who would help me build a life worth living. The fact that we fell in love along the way was just an unexpected bonus, David laughed, pulling her close for a kiss that still carried the same spark of attraction and affection that had surprised them both during those early months of their arranged marriage. An unexpected bonus, he repeated. I like that. Though I'd say the biggest bonus has been discovering that the practical arrangement I thought I wanted was nothing compared to the love story I got instead. As they prepared for bed that night, Patricia paused at the nursery door to check on all three children. Sarah slept with the complete abandon of childhood, her arms flung wide and her face peaceful. Michael had managed to kick off his covers despite the cool night air, and Patricia tucked them back around him with practiced maternal efficiency. Emma stirred slightly when Patricia adjusted her blanket, but settled back into sleep without fully waking, standing there in the doorway, surrounded by the quiet sounds of her family's contentment. Patricia marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd answered David's advertisement because she'd had no other choice, desperate enough to trust her future to a complete stranger. What she'd found was so much more than safety or security. She'd found a true partnership, a love that had grown stronger through every trial they'd faced, and the joy of raising children who would never know what it felt like to be unwanted or unloved. The mail-order bride who had stepped off that stage in Copper Creek with a secret baby and hollow eyes had become Patricia Richardson, beloved wife and mother, respected member of her community, and living proof that sometimes the most desperate gambles lead to the most beautiful victories. And in the morning, she would wake up next to the man who had chosen to love both her and Sarah when he had every reason to turn them away. Surrounded by the children who called them both Mama and Papa, in the home they had built together through courage, determination, and the simple decision to trust in love rather than fear. It was, Patricia thought as she finally joined David in their bed, exactly the kind of happily ever after she'd never dared to dream of, but had somehow managed to create anyway. The mail-order bride had found her fairy tale ending, and it was even better than the stories because it was real. It was earned, and it was theirs to keep forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.